Hey there, students and teachers, and welcome back to the third segment of my lecture on the Stuarts, the English Civil War, and the Glorious Revolution. Now, in the previous segments, we have looked at James I, Charles I, the English Civil War, and the Protectorate. And what we're going to look at this segment is the Restoration, and specifically the reign of Charles II, who was the son of Charles I. And then we'll go on to look at James II and the Glorious Revolution. Now remember, J1, C1, Cromwell, C2, J2, all right? So you've got this kind of mirror image, whether you're making a burger, you're putting your hand up, or anything like that. Now we're on the back nine, that we've had the interregnum, we're done with absolutism, we're restoring the monarchy, but there's still this tension between Parliament and the king, and also this tension between Protestantism, and specifically, now when we looked at James I and Charles I, we were looking more at conflicts within Protestantism. Now we're going to be looking at conflicts between Protestants and Catholics. And there's still that unanswered question, who has ultimate governing authority in Britain? Is it the king or is it Parliament? And so, we've got here with the Stuarts, okay? So now we're looking at C2, Charles II. And so the Restoration monarchs here, Charles II, James II. When you study U.S. history, you may hear about the Restoration colonies. This is, of course, the time that New Netherland became New York and all of that. These two, Charles II and James II, were kings at that time. They were brothers, and I'll explain why the throne went to Charles II's brother rather than Charles II's son. So Charles II, one of my favorite monarchs. I mean, he's just one of those kind of entertaining people that, is probably the least likely to come up on some sort of exam, but still the most entertaining. Now, Charles returned from exile in 1660. He actually was hanging out in the Netherlands. You see these Dutch ships with their flags, from the Dutch Republic. So in 1660, Charles is invited to come back because people were tired of the puritanical rule by this, very, radical Protestant minority. And so they invite the monarch back to restore the monarchy. And Charles II is known as the Merry Monarch. Now, you'd figure that it's good for him to have a good temperament, right? After all, what happened to his father? His father got his head cut off. You want to be agreeable. So Charles is a pretty agreeable guy. He had a good temperament. He also was kind of like Napoleon in the sense that he was born to party, and it wasn't just a play on his name. Charles II he was almost like the anti-Puritan. It's like for every action there is an equal and opposite reaction. Nothing about Charles II's court was the least bit puritanical. Now, one thing I want to shout out to my boy Bentley, the Cavalier KC. He's got his own Instagram page and everything. He is a King Charles Spaniel. Now, a King Charles Spaniel, which a lot of y'all have seen. Seth Rogen has one. A lot of famous people have them. Cute little dogs, but he is a Cavalier King Charles Spaniel, and this is named for Charles II. So that's one of his big claims to fame is this Cavalier King Charles Spaniel. So if you ever get one of those, you say, I know where that came from, the Merry Monarch. He's so cute. Now, the thing is that, what happens here, there's still this tension because Parliament has its laws that it's making, but then the king still wields executive authority. So, to what extent are the laws going to be enforced? Some people may remember, when President Obama, basically said a few years ago that as far as there were some immigration laws that he was not going to enforce urgently, and that is the prerogative of the executive. In certain cases, may say that I've got all of these laws that I'm supposed to enforce. These aren't going to have priority, and ever since the Obama administration, there are some, federal laws, about certain substances that aren't really strictly enforced either. So the executive branch, does have some leeway on what to enforce. And so Charles II issues a declaration of indulgence, which basically he said that he was not going to enforce laws against Catholics and nonconformists. And so what Charles is doing here, and being the Merry Monarch that he is he's going to avoid the problems that his, father and grandfather had. He's saying, look, be whatever Christian religion you want. I'm not going to mess with you. Now, of course, that's not going to be as popular with some of the Anglican Protestants who want to see the Anglican Church as the official religion. Now, what we've got to notice here, and of course, Britain is kind of, when it comes to Europe, not a girl, not yet a woman, whatever. I mean, it's Europe, but it's not Europe. People say that Britain uses metric, but then you go to Britain and they talk about miles and pints and feet and all of that kind of stuff, just like we do. So really there are a lot of things about England, Britain, if you will, that are different. Europe at this time is experiencing a Catholic resurgence. You need to remember that Louis XIV was king of France. Remember, Louis XIV, when he became king, there was limited toleration of Protestant Huguenots. Louis, no more of this. Now, why does Louis do that? He's in a position of strength. There's a Catholic resurgence. He didn't have to tolerate the Protestants, so he's not going to. And so Europe is experiencing this Catholic resurgence, but meanwhile, what you see in Britain is this entrenched Protestantism. And it's kind of interesting when you look today. It's like Britain has this very strange relationship with Europe, don't they? And so they are going in a different direction, that Protestantism is becoming more entrenched. Now, Parliament at this time passed the Test Acts, or an act for preventing dangers which may happen from popish recusants. Now, remember, popish, papist, these are all terms to call Catholics when you don't want to use the nice word Catholic. You just say, well, they're followers of the Pope. They're not universal Christians. And so basically what happened with the Test Acts is that all office holders, now it didn't say that everybody has to be part of the Church of England, but if you want to be somebody in this country, if you want to hold a political office, a government job, or anything like that, I mean, this would be the sort of thing like for most people, teaching is a government job. So, it's like if you want to be in the employ of the government, you have to receive communion in the Anglican Church. And this is what's known as a religious test. So we're going to test your faith. Are you going to take communion in the Anglican Church? Now, if you're in a private business and you don't have anything to do with the government, no big deal. You don't want to be a military officer, no big deal. But if you want to be in the government, you have to be in communion with the Anglican Church. And so what happens here is if we look back, James I and Charles I had insisted on religious uniformity. And then during the Protectorate, you had Protestant toleration. Now, Charles II, you start to see with the Test Acts, an established church with legal privileges in public life, but Christian toleration in private life. If you privately are whatever you want to be, whatever. Now, when we go to James II, we're going to see that James II introduces legal preference for Catholics, which creates another conflict between Parliament and the monarchy. But Charles II doesn't quite go that far. But he is not very much strictly enforcing, some of the laws that are passed by Parliament. You might be familiar with this. It's like if you want to remember the Test Acts, in the U.S. Constitution, it says that there will be no religious test for public office. Okay, so no matter what religion you are in the United States, there is nothing that says that you have to be a Christian or you have to be some type of Christian or something like that to serve in public office. There is no qualification for public office in the United States as far as a profession of religious faith. So the reason why they call it no religious test, that's going after the Test Acts, because at that time you had to be a professing member of the Church of England taking communion in order to hold office. Now, another thing that happens is they're trying to modernize things a little bit. So the monarchy had previously gotten its income from feudal dues. So people are paying their dues to the monarch. Parliament's going to modernize that and really go into something that you see today. There is a royal allowance. Of course, the monarchy today has its private income from its lands, but Parliament pays the monarch a fixed amount each year in lieu of the land taxes. So they're changing how the monarchy is funded. Now, why is this important? This makes the monarchy dependent on Parliament for money. So Parliament will give the monarch an allowance. So this is Parliament saying, we're reining you in. We are making you accountable to us. Now, Charles, meanwhile, Charles II, had a pretty lavish lifestyle. He and his court were into libertinism. There's a movie, The Libertine, which, would never be one to show in schools. I tried to watch it and fell asleep after a few minutes. It's a pretty scandalous, like Johnny Depp kind of movie that's set in Charles II's court. So full of libertines, scandalous characters. There's this guy, the Earl of Rochester, which is the guy that Johnny Depp plays in the movie. You see him just sitting there like, with a monkey and just kind of having fun there. He was a writer of bawdy poetry. Now, bawdy means like, inappropriate, lowbrow kind of, sexual humor and stuff like that. Now, the Earl of Rochester, being the poet that he was, he wrote a poet for his friend Charles. He's in Charles's court. Now, he actually wrote two poems. One was a poem praising Charles. The other was a satire. All right. The other was him sitting there basically roasting Charles II. And he wrote this poem that I can't recite the entirety of here in this with this audience because it's inappropriate. It's wildly inappropriate. Okay, see people are going to be like Googling it now. But the thing is that the couplet that's most often quoted from this poem about Charles II is, "Restless, he rolls about from whore to whore, a merry monarch, scandalous and poor." Now, this is the part I can quote. All right, there's the rest of the poem. And so Charles, he's supposed to, his friend's supposed to give him the poem that said nice things about him, and evidently he accidentally gave Charles the wrong poem. And Rochester had to disappear from court for a little bit, in order to save face. But the thing is that Charles, had lots of children, okay? He had lots of, mistresses and all that. He had about 14 children from about 7 different women. But the problem was that none of these children were legitimate. And this is the time where a king can't just... royal bastards have to live with some degree of comfort. It's not like any of y'all watch Game of Thrones, where the guy's just out there blacksmithing. Charles is a better guy than that. It's like his sons aren't going to be blacksmithing. They're actually, he's putting up these women and children in nice houses and all of this stuff. But Charles did not have a single legitimate heir to the throne. So lots of children, just none of them with his own wife. And so you see basically that what Rochester was making this satirical point about his friend, it's like with friends like that, who needs enemies, I guess. But he's like, basically the king is more concerned with having sex with as many women as he can than with governing the country. And that's the point that's being made here, and I think there's probably a lot of truth to it. But anyway, Charles and Louis were BFFs. Of course, Louis had some of the same interest as Charles, just he was also more interested in government. Now, this is very important here for understanding the Glorious Revolution because, Charles is reaching out to Louis. Louis is fighting the Dutch, okay? Now, also, the Dutch were enemies of the British at this time because they're competing for trade. The Dutch basically are the biggest, trading power in Europe at that time. So Britain and France both had an interest in shutting down the Dutch. And so they become friends. Now, the other thing is Charles has to support all these mistresses, all these illegitimate children, Parliament's being kind of stingy with the allowance. So Louis's like, hey, I've got a lot of money, okay? Or at least I can borrow more money than you can or something like that. But giving you a loan is nothing, compared to what I'm spending on my own house. So Charles and Louis agree to the secret Treaty of Dover. Now, called the secret treaty because there are some provisions that weren't necessarily public, okay, such as the provision. Now, first of all, Charles is going to get money from Louis in return for joining his wars against the Dutch. So Charles is going to bring the British, and specifically the Navy, into this war that Louis is fighting with the Dutch. If you want to hear more about Louis XIV's wars, I've got a video on that. Look for it. I'll put a card up in the video more than likely. So they're going to double team the Dutch, all right? They're going to double team the Dutch. You hear about isn't it double Dutch jump roping or something like that? So you can kind of remember that. They're double teaming the Dutch. Now, here's the thing though. There was another treaty there was another term of the treaty that was hidden. And that term was, remember, Louis's a devout Catholic. I mean, Louis really loves the Catholic Church. And so part of this treaty was that Charles II, if and when an opportune time were to come, Charles II was going to convert to Catholicism. So Louis wants a win for Catholicism as well. But it wasn't anything set in stone. It's just if you see an opportune time, do it. So Charles died without any legitimate issue. You know, as I noted, though, he had acknowledged at least a dozen children by several different women. And on his deathbed, it occurred to him, you know what? Now's an opportune time to convert to Catholicism. And this was actually a big thing among the aristocracy at this time. There was really like a trend toward going back to Catholicism. And he's like, yeah, you know, I told Louis if there was a convenient time I'd do it, get a Catholic priest in here. Let's do this. And so he converts and I guess probably delivers a long confession where he's absolved from, you know, a multitude of sins that he's committed in his court, and he dies. And that's basically the end of Charles II. Now, he is succeeded by his brother, James II, who does not wait until he's on his deathbed to convert to Catholicism. And in the next segment, which will be the final segment of this lecture, we'll look at James II and the Glorious Revolution. See you in a bit.